Wesley Boone walked into Kingsley Crown Logistics carrying nothing but a worn leather satchel and a single hope that he could sign one document and get home before his daughter woke up for school. He wore a jacket that had seen a decade of winters and shoes that had been resoled twice, and the security desk looked at him the way people look at a delivery driver who wandered into the wrong lobby. But Cordelia Kingsley, the polished young chief executive, preparing to dazzle a room full of investors, took one glance at his clothes and his quiet manner and decided he would make a perfect punchline. She pulled him onto the stage, called him the broke single father chasing a rich man's dream, and let the whole room laugh at his expense. Nobody in that glittering hall understood that the man they were mocking held the one signature their entire company could not survive without. If stories like this keep you hooked, tap subscribe right now so you never miss the moment an arrogant executive gets exactly what they deserve. The headquarters of Kingsley Crown Logistics rose out of the business district like a monument to ambition, all glass and polished steel, humming with preparations for the unveiling of Crown Route 3, the company's newest and most expensive logistics platform. Investors, federal partners, and reporters from every major trade publication were expected within the hour, and the entire building moved with the tension of people who understood that billions of dollars hung on the next 90 minutes. Wesley Boone arrived early, his satchel tucked under one arm, his eyes tired from an overnight drive he had taken to make the appointment on time. He had been invited personally by Augustus Kingsley, the company's honorary chairman, to review the final technical approval before Crown Route 3 went live under a massive federal contract. But the young woman at the front desk did not recognize his name on any priority list, and she directed him toward a side waiting area near the loading entrance, the place reserved for vendors and repair technicians. Wesley did not argue. He had learned long ago that explaining himself to people who had already decided who he was rarely changed anything, so he simply sat down and waited, watching well-dressed employees pass without a glance in his direction. While he waited, Wesley studied the enormous digital banner hanging above the atrium, the one announcing Crown Route 3 as the future of American logistics, and felt a strange mixture of pride and unease settle in his chest. He had spent years building the earliest version of that system alone in a small rented office, coding through nights when his daughter was still an infant, certain that someday the work would matter to more than just himself. Watching a company of this size stake its entire reputation on his invention, without most of its leadership even remembering his name, reminded him how easily credit could be rewritten by people who controlled the stage and the microphone. He was not there for recognition. He simply wanted to confirm that the version about to be unveiled to the country had not been quietly altered in ways that could put real shipments, real medicine, and real people at risk. Still, some old and familiar frustration crept into him as he watched employees in expensive suits stride past without a second glance. The same frustration he had carried since the earliest days of his career, when investors dismissed his ideas until someone with better tailoring repeated them back. Cordelia swept through the lobby a few minutes later with her communications team trailing behind her, discussing camera angles and opening remarks for the investor presentation. When her media director, Marissa Sterling, mentioned the man from the community outreach list waiting near the loading dock, something a junior assistant had mislabeled Wesley as, Cordelia laughed under her breath and asked what he looked like. Marissa described the jacket, the satchel, the tired eyes, and the two women exchanged a look that needed no words, because Cordelia had been searching all morning for a way to soften her image before a crowd of skeptical investors. She wanted a moment of warmth, something that would make her seem approachable rather than icy, and an ordinary-looking stranger seemed like the perfect prop. Marissa suggested pulling him onto the stage during the opening segment, asking him what he would do if he ran the company for a single day and letting the audience enjoy a harmless little joke before the real presentation began. Wesley had no idea what was being planned for him as he sat quietly with his satchel resting against his leg. Inside that worn leather bag were three things that mattered more than anyone in the building understood. The original licensing agreement from years earlier, a technical report detailing a dangerous flaw in Crown Route 3, and a signed clause granting him final approval rights whenever the platform touched high-risk sectors like medicine or federal shipping. He checked his phone once, hoping for a message from his sister about his daughter, then closed his eyes for a moment of rest. An assistant soon appeared and guided him toward a back hallway, telling him cheerfully that he would get his few minutes on stage before the important business began. Cordelia watched him disappear down the corridor and turned back to her team with a satisfied smile, remarking quietly that at least the man would be useful for something today. The presentation opened before a packed hall of investors, bankers, transportation partners, and journalists who covered the logistics industry for a living. Cordelia stood center stage in a tailored suit, her voice smooth and confident as she described a future where Crown Route 3 could coordinate thousands of trucks, refrigerated warehouses, and medical supply chains with a precision no competitor could match. The crowd listened with the focused attention of people deciding whether to invest their money, and for several minutes, Cordelia commanded the room exactly as she intended. Then, without warning to anyone but her closest staff, she called Wesley Boone onto the stage. He believed he had been summoned to address a technical question, but as he stepped into the light, a screen behind him lit up with a mocking headline asking whether one broke single father could run a billion-dollar company. Laughter rippled through the hall immediately, and Cordelia turned toward him with a playful, condescending smile, asking whether his first move as chief executive would be fixing the coffee machine or demanding a raise. Marissa laughed loudly from the side of the stage, several executives clapped along, and Wesley stood frozen under the lights, unable to react strongly because every camera in the building was now pointed directly at his face. Cordelia kept going, using him as a symbol of reckless ambition, framing him as a hopeful dreamer who had wandered far outside his depth. The way she phrased it left no doubt in the audience's mind that she saw him as a poor man entertaining a fantasy, and she had no idea the moment was being live-streamed to internal screens throughout the building, where several journalists were quietly recording every second on their phones. Wesley finally spoke, his voice calm and even despite the mockery surrounding him, saying that if he ran the company for one day, he would read every document carefully before selling it to the entire country. A handful of engineers near the front of the room went suddenly still at those words, sensing something the rest of the crowd missed entirely. But Cordelia brushed the remark aside, telling the audience that outsiders always liked to sound dramatic. A few investors in the front rows exchanged uncertain glances rather than laughing along, sensing something uncomfortable in watching a powerful young executive mock a man who had done nothing to deserve it. One older banker leaned toward his colleague and murmured that the joke felt cruel rather than clever, though his voice was lost beneath the applause filling the rest of the hall. Cordelia, riding the energy of the room, never noticed the pockets of discomfort scattered among the crowd, too focused on the warm laughter closer to the stage to register the quieter unease further back. Photographers captured the moment from multiple angles, freezing Wesley's calm expression beside Cordelia's amused smile in an image that would soon circulate far beyond the walls of the building. For a brief moment, Wesley's eyes met Augustus Kingsley's from across the hall, and the older man's expression carried something close to quiet dread, as though he alone understood exactly what his daughter had just done. As Wesley walked off the stage, Marissa whispered to Cordelia that the clip was destined to spread across every internal network within the hour. Cordelia felt pleased, believing the investors had enjoyed a light-hearted moment that made her seem more human, completely unaware that she had just humiliated the one person with the legal power to approve or block Crown Route 3. Wesley did not leave the building. He returned to the back row of the hall, sat quietly, and stared up at the glowing company logo above the stage, understanding with total clarity that Kingsley Crown did not merely need a technical fix. It needed to learn, in the most public way possible, the true cost of arrogance. Security eventually guided Wesley away from the reserved seating section, and a young staff member apologized awkwardly for the confusion, but Wesley simply said it was fine, because he had grown used to people judging his worth by his jacket long before they noticed anything about his mind. Years earlier, he had founded a small engineering firm called Boone Systems Lab, where he built the original routing algorithm that coordinated shipments across multiple industries in real time. Kingsley Crown had purchased the rights to expand and commercialize that technology into what eventually became Crown Route. But the original agreement had never granted full and unconditional ownership. Wesley retained final approval authority whenever the platform was deployed in high-stakes sectors such as pharmaceuticals, hospital logistics, or federal shipping contracts, a detail buried deep in paperwork that most of the current executive team had never bothered to read. The reason Wesley kept such a low profile traced back to the loss of his wife several years earlier, after which he stepped away from the spotlight of the industry to raise his daughter somewhere quiet and stable. The story touched on his daughter only briefly, noting that she was staying with her aunt while he handled this trip, and that he hoped to finish everything quickly so he could return home to her. Augustus Kingsley had always respected Wesley for being the true architect behind the platform his company now depended on, and it was Augustus who personally invited him to review the Crown Route 3 upgrade before the company finalized a federal contract worth billions of dollars. Unfortunately, Cordelia had skimmed her father's message rather than reading it in full, leaving the guest list and scheduling details to Marissa and Preston, which is how Wesley ended up treated like an unlisted stranger instead of the most important guest in the building. Inside Wesley's satchel sat the 3 items that would soon upend the entire event: the original licensing contract, a technical report outlining a critical flaw in Crown Route 3, and the clause granting him the right to withhold approval if the system was deployed outside its intended safety standards. Without his signature, the federal contract could not legally proceed, and if he chose to make the flaw public, the company's stock could collapse within hours of the announcement. Preston Whitaker, the company's chief financial officer, understood fragments of this history but deliberately kept the full picture from Cordelia, hoping her carelessness would push Wesley into refusing to sign entirely. If that happened, Preston expected the board to blame Cordelia for the disaster, clearing a path for Whitaker Capital to acquire the weakened company at a steep discount. Augustus had followed Wesley's career quietly for years, long before Cordelia ever took the corner office, watching from a distance as Boone Systems Lab grew from a 2-person operation into a respected engineering practice known for solving problems larger firms could not. He had personally championed the original licensing deal, insisting that the contract preserve Wesley's approval rights rather than stripping them away entirely, a decision the younger executives at the time considered overly cautious and unnecessary. Over the years, as Kingsley Crown expanded and its leadership changed, fewer and fewer people remembered why that clause existed at all, until it became little more than a forgotten paragraph buried inside a much larger agreement. Augustus never forgot. He had watched his daughter grow more confident and more distant at the same time, absorbing the family's obsession with image while losing touch with the substance that once made the company worth respecting. Inviting Wesley back for the crown route. 3 review was, in part, Augustus's quiet attempt to remind Cordelia that the foundation of their success had always rested on people like him, people whose value could never be measured by the cut of their jacket. Near the end of the opening segment, Wesley received a message from Augustus, who wrote simply that he hoped Wesley would give his daughter, Cordelia, one chance to hear the truth before everything fell apart. Wesley glanced toward the stage, where Cordelia was still smiling and shaking hands with investors, utterly unaware of the storm gathering behind her. He typed a short reply, saying he would give her that chance, but not one more moment of being treated like a joke. The event shifted into its centerpiece, a live demonstration of Crown Route, 3 coordinating medical shipments, refrigerated food deliveries, and emergency equipment across the country in real time. Cordelia announced with total confidence that a successful demonstration would cement Kingsley Crown as the most powerful logistics company in America, and the crowd leaned forward eagerly to watch the simulation begin. Almost immediately, the routes began to fail. Refrigerated cargo was rerouted through a corridor with no cooling infrastructure, medical trucks were funneled directly into severe congestion, and backup warehouses locked themselves out of the system entirely. The technical team backstage went pale, because this exact flaw had been flagged weeks earlier and quietly dismissed so the event could proceed on schedule. Cordelia forced a smile as she watched confusion spread through the crowd, while Preston immediately suggested pausing the demonstration and blaming a simple display error. But one of the federal representatives in attendance demanded a real explanation on the spot, pointing out that a failure of this scale in an actual deployment could put lives at risk. A young engineer leaned close to Cordelia and whispered that they urgently needed Wesley Boone, the man who had written the original core system years earlier. Cordelia's irritation flared as she asked why they needed the very man she had just turned into a punchline, and the engineer answered quietly that without his signature, the company had no legal right to deploy version 3 at all. For the first time all day, Cordelia's composure cracked completely. She realized the man she had mocked in front of hundreds of investors was not some community guest brought in for a feel-good moment, but the single individual holding the keys to the company's survival. Meanwhile, the clip of her humiliating him on stage had already begun spreading beyond the building, as several journalists began writing pieces criticizing the toxic culture at Kingsley Crown. Investors who had laughed only an hour earlier now exchanged worried glances, uncertain what to make of a chief executive who had ridiculed the very engineer their entire technology depended on. Panic spread quickly through the technical staff stationed behind the main screen, several of them frantically typing commands in a desperate attempt to halt the simulation before it embarrassed the company any further. One senior engineer admitted under his breath that the warning signs had been sitting in an internal report for weeks, buried beneath more urgent-looking tasks, because nobody wanted to be the person who delayed a launch this significant. Federal representatives in the audience began quietly conferring with one another, their expressions shifting from polite interest to visible concern as the failures multiplied across the display. A veteran logistics partner leaned toward a colleague and remarked that no company should be trusted with medical shipments if it could not even coordinate a rehearsed presentation. Cordelia felt the room's confidence draining away in real time, and for the first time that day, she understood that no clever phrase or practiced smile could talk her way out of what was unfolding on the screen behind her. Grant Blackwell, the chairman of the board, demanded that Cordelia bring Wesley into a private room immediately. But Wesley was no longer sitting in the back row waiting to be summoned. He had already left the main hall and settled into a chair downstairs, calmly sipping a paper cup of coffee, carrying himself with the quiet certainty of a man who understood the entire company was about to come looking for him. Augustus found his daughter backstage, his expression heavier than she had seen in years, and told her plainly that she had not turned Wesley into a joke at all. She had turned the entire company into one. Wesley was escorted into an emergency meeting room, and the atmosphere could not have been more different from the mocking laughter on stage only an hour earlier. Cordelia tried to maintain her executive composure, but her voice had tightened with genuine fear as she asked him to sign the technical approval immediately, promising that the company would make up for the earlier misunderstanding afterward. Wesley neither raised his voice nor accepted her offer. He simply set his satchel on the table and told her, calmly, that her real problem was not that he had been embarrassed, but that she had sold a system to the entire country without ever understanding how it truly worked. He opened the technical report and pointed to the exact section, showing that the finance division had altered Crown Route 3 to cut server and sensor costs, changes that made the algorithm prioritize short-term savings over safety along critical shipping routes. If deployed under the federal contract as written, the company would be in direct violation of safety standards required by law, and the consequences would extend far beyond a public relations problem. Preston tried to dismiss Wesley as an outdated engineer clinging to relevance, but Wesley calmly produced internal messages, cost revision records, system access logs, and safety warnings that had been labeled unnecessary before the event, all of which proved Preston had deliberately hidden the risk to protect the company's stock price. Then came the first major revelation. Wesley explained that he was not merely the original programmer of an old system, but the legal owner of what he called the Boone Protocol, the core routing technology underpinning every high-risk deployment of the platform. Kingsley Crown only held the right to use it in federal contracts with his direct approval, a detail buried in paperwork most of the current leadership had never fully understood. The second revelation followed immediately after, as Wesley made clear that any attempt to deploy the system without his signature would void the federal contract entirely, trigger the bank's right to recall the bridge loan financing the rollout, and give partners legal grounds to switch to a competing provider. The third revelation landed hardest of all. Wesley admitted he had already prepared a full correction package capable of saving the entire system, but after being publicly humiliated in front of hundreds of people, he no longer had any reason to trust the current leadership to use it responsibly. Wesley continued laying out the timeline in careful detail, showing the room exactly when the safety thresholds had been quietly loosened and who had approved the change without consulting the original engineering team. He explained that the altered version might function perfectly well under ordinary conditions, but during a surge in demand or a severe weather event, the very scenarios the federal contract was designed to protect against, the system would fail in precisely the way the demonstration had just shown. Grant Blackwell asked bluntly whether the flaw could be fixed before the certification deadline, and Wesley answered that it could, but only if the company restored the original safety parameters and gave his team direct access to the core system without further interference from finance. Preston attempted one final objection, insisting that restoring the old parameters would blow through the remaining budget for the quarter, but Grant silenced him with a sharp glance, clearly recalculating who in the room still deserved his trust. Cordelia sat perfectly still through all of it, absorbing each detail like a series of small, precise blows, finally beginning to grasp how far her company had drifted from the principles that once made it worth building. Cordelia's face drained of color as the full weight of the situation settled over her, and she understood at last that her small joke on stage had transformed a routine technical negotiation into a crisis that could destroy the company she had inherited. Cordelia asked to speak with Wesley alone, and the two of them stood together in a glass-walled office overlooking the main hall, where the humiliating clip of him on stage was still being passed around among stunned employees. She watched herself on a nearby screen, elegant and powerful, laughing at a simple man she had turned into entertainment for a room full of strangers, and something about seeing it from the outside finally broke through her defenses. At first, she tried once more to solve the problem with money, offering him a substantial consulting fee, a long-term contract, and a small equity stake in the project, but Wesley refused every offer without hesitation. He told her plainly that what she needed to buy back was not his signature, but the trust she had personally destroyed only hours earlier. Her voice softened as she admitted, almost reluctantly, that she had grown up inside the Kingsley family under constant scrutiny, where every mistake was remembered and every weakness was exploited by board members hungry for power. She said she had learned to project coldness because showing vulnerability had always been treated as a fatal flaw for an heir expected to run a massive company. Wesley listened without interrupting, then answered simply that pressure from her own family gave her no right to turn a stranger into a punchline for entertainment. She admitted, almost as an afterthought, that she had watched the recording of herself on stage at least a dozen times since stepping off it, unable to reconcile the woman in the video with the person she believed herself to be. Wesley told her, without cruelty but without softening the truth either, that the version of herself she saw in that recording was not a distortion or a bad angle, but exactly who she had chosen to become in that moment. He reminded her that power without humility eventually turns every relationship into a transaction, and that the people beneath her, the drivers, the warehouse workers, the engineers who never got a microphone, deserved leadership that saw them as people rather than props for a quarterly earnings call. Cordelia lowered her eyes, and for the first time since he had met her that morning, she looked less like a chief executive and more like a young woman who had inherited a kingdom she was never fully taught how to run with any real compassion. This was the turning point of the entire story, the moment Cordelia finally said the words clearly, admitting that she had used him to earn a laugh from investors and that she was now standing in front of him begging him to save the company she had nearly destroyed. Wesley did not offer forgiveness immediately, but he laid out clear conditions for moving forward. Cordelia would need to apologize publicly, suspend Preston pending a full investigation, disclose the truth to their federal partners, restore the original safety standards that had been quietly stripped away, and sign a genuine partnership agreement with Boone Systems Lab as equals rather than as a vendor. Cordelia hesitated, worried about the damage such honesty might cause to her public image, but Wesley reminded her that her image was already gone, and the only remaining question was whether she wanted to lose the company along with it. Those words seemed to finally break through the last of her resistance, and she walked back into the main meeting room, no longer trying to hide the truth, choosing for the first time in her career to protect something more lasting than her polished reputation. Cordelia returned to the boardroom and announced, without hesitation, that Preston Whitaker was suspended from all financial authority over the project effective immediately. Preston erupted in anger, accusing Wesley of exploiting the chaos to extort the company for personal gain. But Grant Blackwell and the rest of the board had already reviewed enough evidence to see through the accusation. Marissa attempted to salvage the situation by suggesting a press release claiming the on-stage moment with Wesley had been a scripted bit planned in advance, but Wesley rejected the idea outright, warning that if the company kept lying, he would withdraw every approval and forward his full report directly to their federal partners. Cordelia was left with only one real choice. She stood before an internal camera and admitted plainly that Wesley Boone was not a hired actor, not a community guest, and not a hopeful job seeker who had wandered into the wrong building. He was the man who built the foundation their entire company depended on, and she had treated him disgracefully in front of hundreds of witnesses. The apology sent immediate shockwaves through the organization, angering some investors who felt leadership had lost control of the narrative, while their federal partners privately respected the decision to disclose the truth before finalizing a massive contract. Nothing was fixed yet, but the company had earned one final chance to prove it deserved to survive. As the dust settled, Preston's scheme finally came fully into view, revealing that he had deliberately pushed the company toward crisis so that Whitaker Capital could swoop in and purchase it at a fraction of its true value. Grant Blackwell, who cared primarily about protecting shareholder interests, turned against Preston the moment the plan became clear, severing ties without a hint of loyalty. Marissa was removed from crisis communications entirely, since she had personally engineered the humiliating segment that ignited the entire disaster in the first place. Word of the suspension and the abandoned cover story spread through the company within minutes, and for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, employees on the lower floors spoke openly about leadership without lowering their voices. Some expressed quiet satisfaction that Preston's manipulations had finally caught up with him, while others simply felt relieved that someone with real technical authority was finally being allowed to fix what had been broken for months. A junior analyst who had once been ordered to bury the original safety warning came forward voluntarily, providing additional records that made Preston's misconduct even harder to dispute. Grant Blackwell, sensing the shifting mood throughout the organization, called an emergency session with the remaining board members to review every decision Preston had influenced over the past year. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the company Cordelia had inherited looked nothing like the one she had walked into only a day earlier, stripped of its comfortable illusions and forced to confront exactly how close it had come to catastrophe. Wesley agreed to remain for 24 hours to help repair the system, but he made his motivation unmistakably clear from the start. He was not staying because Cordelia deserved his help, but because thousands of workers, drivers, engineers, and everyday customers did not deserve to suffer for the arrogance of a few people sitting in glass offices high above them. By the end of that meeting, the balance of power inside the room had completely reversed. The man once mocked for daring to imagine running the company was now the one setting every condition, while the people who had laughed loudest were left standing quietly, waiting to be told what to do next. Wesley led a small technical team into the operations center late that night, far from any stage or spotlight, surrounded only by error screens, raw data, and a deadline creeping closer by the hour. He walked the engineers through every flaw in the upgraded platform, showing them exactly where priority routes had been altered for profit, where sensors had been quietly downgraded, and where backup servers had been cut to make quarterly numbers look better on paper. The engineers, who had dismissed him as an outsider only hours earlier, grew increasingly humbled as they watched him navigate the system with a mastery none of them could match. Cordelia no longer retreated to her private office to wait for updates. She stayed in the operations center herself, calling federal partners directly, accepting full responsibility in front of the board, and personally signing the order to restore the engineering budget that had been quietly gutted months earlier. It was the first real sign of change in her, a shift from a woman who once used people as props to one willing to stand in the room and absorb the consequences of her own decisions. Amid the long night, there was one brief and quiet moment from Wesley's life outside the company walls, as his daughter called to ask when he would be coming home. He told her softly that he was fixing something very important and that he would be back as soon as it was finished, keeping the exchange short and gentle to protect the tenderness of that small piece of his world. As morning approached, The team ran the final simulation, and for several tense minutes the screens filled with a steady stream of error alerts that left the entire room holding its breath. Then Wesley entered the last correction from the Boone Protocol, and the routes began adjusting themselves correctly in real time, sending medical shipments into properly cooled storage, guiding emergency vehicles around congestion, and stabilizing every backup server across the network. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, one of the younger engineers finally worked up the courage to ask Wesley why he had stayed calm through the entire ordeal, instead of simply walking away and letting the company collapse under the weight of its own mistakes. Wesley considered the question for a moment before answered. Walking away would have punished the wrong people, since the drivers on the road and the families waiting on medical shipments had never laughed at him on that stage. Cordelia overheard the exchange from across the room and said nothing, but something in her posture shifted, as though she were filing the answer away for later, understanding it as a lesson far more valuable than anything she had learned in years of formal business training. As dawn approached, the operations center grew quieter, filled only with the soft hum of servers and the occasional exchange of technical instructions between exhausted engineers determined to finish what they had started. Wesley rubbed his eyes once, thought briefly of his daughter asleep at home, and returned his full attention to the screen in front of him, running one final check before allowing the system anywhere near a live certification test. Crown Route 3 finally passed its technical certification, but the story was far from finished, because the board, the investors, and the press were all still waiting to see who would ultimately be held accountable for a joke that had nearly destroyed one of the largest logistics companies in the country. The following morning, Kingsley Crown held a formal press conference, and Cordelia walked out with none of the untouchable confidence she once carried so effortlessly. She stood before the cameras and openly admitted that she had turned a technical partner into a punchline, allowing a culture of contempt for ordinary people to take root inside her own company. Wesley did not stand beside her as a prop this time. He was introduced by his true title, founder of Boone Systems Lab, architect of the Boone Protocol, and the newly named strategic partner overseeing Crown Route going forward, a formal and public restoration of the respect he had been denied only a day earlier. Reporters in the room pressed for details about how such a significant flaw had gone unnoticed for so long, and Cordelia answered each question directly, instead of deflecting toward prepared talking points the way she once might have done. She acknowledged that the company's internal culture had rewarded speed and appearance over careful engineering, and that the failure on stage the previous day had simply exposed a problem that had been quietly growing for months. One journalist asked Wesley directly how it felt to be mocked publicly by the very company whose survival now depended on him, and he answered without bitterness, saying that people often confuse a quiet manner for weakness, and that mistake usually costs them far more than they expect. The room fell silent for a moment at his response, several reporters exchanging glances before scribbling the line into their notes, recognizing it as the kind of moment that would define coverage of the story for weeks to come. By the time the press conference ended, the narrative had shifted entirely, no longer about a company unveiling an impressive new platform, but about the price of underestimating the people who build the systems everyone else depends on. Yet the consequences of that single joke reached far beyond one apology, because the company kept its technology but lost nearly everything else that leadership once treated as untouchable. Cordelia lost her absolute control over the organization, forced by the board to sign an independent oversight agreement that permanently shared technical authority with Boone Systems Lab. Kingsley Crown could no longer treat its core technology as a private possession to modify however leadership pleased without outside review. Preston Whitaker lost his position entirely, along with his reputation, facing a formal investigation into concealed safety risks and clear conflicts of interest that endangered the entire federal contract. Whitaker Capital lost its opportunity to seize the weakened company at a discount, its plan exposed before it could ever be executed. Marissa Sterling lost her senior communications role, the direct result of engineering a public humiliation that spiraled into the very crisis she had been hired to prevent. Grant Blackwell lost his position of unquestioned authority within the boardroom, forced to answer difficult questions about how such a toxic culture had been allowed to fester directly under his oversight. Major investors demanded structural changes throughout the organization. The once flawless public image of the Kingsley family cracked permanently in the eyes of the public, and Cordelia lost the one thing she had clung to most tightly her entire life: the quiet belief that her status made her fundamentally better than the people she once looked down upon. Industry observers who once covered Kingsley Crown purely for its financial performance began writing about the incident as a turning point for corporate culture across the logistics sector, using it as an example of what happens when leadership mistakes cruelty for charisma. Business schools eventually referenced the episode as a case study in the danger of treating technical partners as disposable, noting how quickly a single careless moment on a stage could unravel years of carefully built credibility. Cordelia, for her part, never fully escaped the shadow of that morning, though those who worked closely with her afterward noticed a genuine change in how she listened, how she credited the people behind her decisions, and how rarely she reached for a joke at someone else's expense. Augustus watched his daughter's transformation with quiet relief, telling a close friend privately that he finally recognized in her the qualities he had always hoped she would grow into, long before he ever expected a stranger in a worn jacket to be the one who taught her the lesson. Still, the company did not collapse entirely, because Wesley made a deliberate choice to protect the innocent people who depended on it for their livelihoods. He did not seek revenge by burning the entire organization to the ground out of anger or pride. He simply made certain that everyone involved paid the exact price their contempt had earned them, no more and no less. A form of accountability rooted in fairness rather than cruelty. Several months later, Crown Route operated successfully under the careful oversight of Boone Systems Lab, its routes running smoothly across the country, without a single major failure. Wesley walked back into the Kingsley Crown building once more, and this time the atmosphere could not have felt more different. Nobody laughed. Nobody pulled him onto a stage to serve as anyone's entertainment. Security opened the door for him without hesitation. Employees rose respectfully as he passed, and Cordelia herself stood waiting for him in the lobby, with none of the arrogance she once wore so easily. Employees who passed them in the lobby paused for a moment, some remembering the video that had once circulated through every department, others simply sensing that something important had shifted in the balance of the building. The stage where Wesley had been mocked now stood dark and empty, waiting for the next event, stripped of the glittering lights and laughter that once filled it at his expense. Cordelia noticed him glance toward it, and said quietly that the stage would be used differently from now on, reserved for genuine achievements rather than cheap moments of entertainment at someone else's cost. She greeted him simply, saying that the board was waiting for their partner to join the meeting, a title she now used without a trace of mockery in her voice. Wesley glanced briefly toward the very stage where he had once been humiliated in front of hundreds of strangers, then turned back to her with quiet composure. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet between them carrying far more weight than any headline or press release ever could, a silence built not on tension but on a hard-won and mutual respect. Cordelia extended her hand, and Wesley shook it firmly, both of them aware that the gesture meant something entirely different from the polished handshakes exchanged for cameras only months before. He told her that was good, because today he had not come to be anyone's joke. The man who had once been mocked for daring to imagine sitting at the top no longer needed to raise his voice to prove his worth, because he had already let the truth speak for itself. And in the end, the people who had laughed the loudest were the very ones left with the least.